Hello. All right. Now we're going to talk about Arc Flash. Probably something you haven't heard too much about. Um, and this particular video here, um, with me yakking at you, is going to be just general information about it. And so then there'll be some other videos from YouTube that will give you more information and training and that type of thing on it. You'll hear more technical information. But you have to understand one thing about Arc Flash. It is an NFPA. We're going to talk a lot about that too if I ever get this thing going back to where I want to be. It's an NFPA standard, and we'll talk about how it's not an OSHA standard, but it is OSHA standard later on in this video. But and also it updates every 3 years. So some of the information you're going to see may get changed every 3 years. So when you go through this, all the stuff I'm going to throw at you here, it's going to be probably from a couple of different editions of this, because that's what these YouTube videos were made. But like OSHA, it doesn't change a lot, but it does. So if you're going to do an Arc Flash program, you need to get yourself a hold of a copy of 70E. That's the NFPA standard. So here's what Arc Flash is. It occurs when a flashover electric current leaves its intended path and travels through the air, that's why it's an arc, from one conductor to another or to ground. And sometimes that's a person. And that's not good. The results are usually violent, and when a human is in close proximity to the arc flash, serious injury and even death can occur. Arc flash can be caused by many things, including dust, dropping tools, accidental touching, condensation, material failure, corrosion, faulty installation. When we were doing some arc flash training at OK Foods, this guy had a video, and I haven't seen it, where a guy was at a bowling alley, bowling. He wasn't an electrician, he was a bowler at a bowling alley. And the bowling alley had a power failure in half the bowling alley. And the owner just said to everybody, hey, hang loose. I got a buddy of mine, electrician. You can come over and fix it. So this electrician comes, he's got a big electrical panel, and he's standing about 8 feet, they're 8 or 10 feet away from him, kind of watching what this guy's doing. And he pulls the panel off the front of the electrical panel, and it slips out of his hand, and it drops back into the panel and creates an arc flash. This guy 8 feet away ends up in the hospital too. I mean, that's how it can happen with Arc Flash. So he ended up being okay, but he spent a while in the hospital, some burns. So that's one of the things. It can be caused by a lot of things. Probably one of the most common one of those is either accidental touching or dropping a tool or dropping a part or something like that. But there's a lot of other things that could cause it. Faulty installation too. 3 factors determine the severity of arc flash injury: proximity of the worker to the hazard, temperature, time for the circuit to break, response time of the circuit interruption. And part of the arc flash hazard incident analysis is the usually done by an electrical engineer. They have to know the response time of the circuit interruption, the breaker or the fuses, and how long it's going to take for that thing to open up before they can determine what the arc flash is going to be like, or what the hazard, I should say, the hazard is going to be like. So the proximity of the worker to the hazard is probably the most important thing. Because of the violent nature of an arc flash exposure, when an employee is injured, the injury is usually serious and even resulting in death. It is not uncommon for an injured employee to never regain their past quality of life. Extended medical care is often required, sometimes costing in excess of $1 million. This is nothing to play with. Typical results from arc flash are burns. Non-FR clothing can burn into skin. One thing that'll come up is non-FR, non-fire retardant. But one of the basic things of arc flash is you wear cotton clothing or natural fiber clothing. Why? Cotton will burn? Yes, it will. But polyester or any kind of synthetic clothing will melt. You'd rather have it burn than melt to your skin. So a long sleeve cotton shirt and like denim pants, that's part of the uniforms of people, electricians. Fire, of course, fire can spread rapidly through the building. Usually it seems in the videos I've seen, the arc flash in like a electrical room, so there's not a lot of flammables around. Flying objects, molten metal, part of this, when the temperature is so hot, it melts, turns metal into steam. And when you turn water into steam, what happens? It expands. When you turn like copper into steam, it expands even more than water, way more than water. the blast pressure, the noise even, and the noise can reach 140 decibels, a lot of the gun. And the heat, that can be as high as 35,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's hot. That's hotter than the surface of the sun. Now, there's a couple of different boundaries, approach protection boundaries. The NFPA has developed specific approach boundaries designed to protect employees while working on or near energized equipment. From the farthest away to the closest, here's what they're called. Flash protection boundary, that's the outermost boundary. The limited approach boundary, restricted approach boundary, and the prohibited approach boundary. We'll talk about more of these. You'll hear a lot of them. I wish that had just said like A, B, C, D. It might have been easier to keep it in your mind, which is which, instead of having to know that what flash and which is what, but this is the way it is. The flash protection boundary, that's the farthest established boundary from the energy source. If an arc flash occurred, this boundary is where an employee would be exposed to a curable second-degree burn, and that's 1.2 calories per square centimeter. The issue here is the heat generated from a flash that results in burns. So they're saying a curable second-degree burn, 1.2 calories per centimeter squared. So you're going to hear that figure a lot in arc flash of calories. And when they saw cal, they're going to talk about 8 cal. That's 8 calories per square meter. Per square centimeter. Remember, a centimeter is not very big. Centimeters only made by 8. So 1.2 calories per centimeter squared is what they figure would be a curable second-degree burn. Limited approach boundary, the distance from an exposed live part where a shock hazard exists. Restricted approach boundary, distance from an exposed live part where there's an increased risk of shock. And the prohibited approach boundary is a distance from an exposed part, which is considered the same as making contact with a live part. So in other words, it's right up close to it. The distance is not the same for all equipment. Some equipment will have greater boundaries than others. That's why when the arc flash analysis or the hazard analysis is done, that each piece of equipment gets tagged, and this information will be on the tag, and it'll be different. They can be right next to other, and they'll have different boundaries and different PPE perhaps. Now, ways to protect the worker. There are a number of ways to protect workers from the threat of electrical hazards. Some of the methods are for the protection of qualified employees doing work on electrical circuits, and other methods are geared towards non-qualified employees who work nearby energized equipment. Some of the protective measures: de-energize the circuit. That's the main thing. That's the main thing what you want to do, de-energize the circuit. Work practices, insulation could be, guarding could come into play, barricades, ground fault circuit interrupters, GFCIs, or secondary protection of grounding, which is be a secondary protection. So if work must be done on energized circuits, and most of the time you want circuits to be de-energized before anybody works on them, but that can't always be done. And so if de-energizing a circuit is not feasible and the employee must work hot, the employer shall develop and enforce safety-related work practices to prevent electric shock or other injuries resulting either from direct or indirect electrical contact. Direct is contact, you touch it. Indirect means something you're holding touches it, usually a tool or a part. These specific safety-related work practices shall be consistent with the nature and extent of the associated electrical hazards and could include energized electrical work permits, personal protective equipment, insulated tools, written safety program, job briefings. All these are good things to do. Work permits. There's permits for a lot of different things. Well, you have your company policy, you have permits for anything you want to, but and they're good because they make people focus on it and make somebody say, yeah, this is okay. You're right. You got the right PPE. You're doing this right. All right. And that's kind of what the nice thing about permits are, in my opinion. Of course, the most effective and foolproof way to eliminate the risk of electrical shock or arc flash is to de-energize and lock out the equipment. In other words, arc flashes doesn't replace lockout. Understanding the arc flash warning label. Each piece of equipment operating at 50 volts or more and not de-energized must be evaluated for arc flash and shock protection. This evaluation will determine the actual boundaries and will inform the employees of what PPE must be worn. Once the evaluation is complete, an arc flash hazard warning label must be affixed to the equipment and readily accessible to employees who may work on the energized equipment. Well, if it's affixed to the equipment in front of it, I mean, it's right there. So The employee obligation. Employees must follow the requirements of the Arc Flash hazard label by wearing the proper PPE, the use of insulated tools, and other safety-related precautions. This includes not working on or near the circuit unless you are a qualified worker. A qualified person is one who has received training in and has demonstrated skills and knowledge in the construction and operation of electric equipment and installations and the hazards involved. That's only one sentence, but it encompasses quite a bit. And you'll see, you'll get more information on that in some of the videos I'm going to present here. Additional requirements for qualified persons. Qualified persons, those permitted to work on or near energized parts, shall at a minimum be trained in and familiar with the following: the skills and techniques necessary to distinguish exposed live parts from other parts of electric equipment. You've heard that before. The skills and techniques necessary to determine the nominal voltage of exposed live parts. You've heard that before too. The clearance distance is specified in 1910.333C and the corresponding voltage to which the qualified personnel will be exposed. Here are the first two parts of 1910.333C, just for reference. Working on or near exposed energized parts. Application. This paragraph applies to work performed on exposed live parts involving either direct contact or by means of tools or materials, or near enough to them for employees to be exposed to any hazard they present. And C2, work on energized equipment. Only qualified persons may work on electric circuit parts or equipment that have not been de-energized under the procedures of paragraph B of this section. Such persons shall be capable of working safely on energized circuits and shall be familiar with the proper use of special precautionary techniques, personal protective equipment, insulating and shielding materials, and insulated tools. Now, here you go. And I'm going to go on a whole different tack here. This is going to be like this 3 parts of this thing. This is the second part. I went through the whole Arc Flash procedure at OK Foods. I don't remember how it started, and but we had an electrical engineer that was involved in very much of the electrical work that was done at most facilities. So he was very familiar with our facilities, and he was an electrical engineer. He was a good guy. So we got him, contacted him. It was very expensive. I don't remember how much it was, but it was a whole lot of money. I mean, it was, you know, I'm going to say $75,000 to $125,000 in that range, because we had a lot of facilities. Remember that too. You had 3 plants at Fort Smith and 2 at Muldrow. You had feed mills and had hatcheries, so a lot of places to go. And the EE, the electrical engineer, he visited every facility. He took pictures of every control room, all the motor controllers, electric panels, everything. He was very thorough. And over time, then he produced the single line drawings and the information for the labels, and then the labels, which he printed and put on the equipment. Single line drawings are electrical drawings. And you'll see in some of these videos why they have to come on site and do it. So why whoever's doing it. He subcontracted with a very experienced trainer, and every employee involved in maintenance, and I think most supervisors, even they weren't maintenance, went through it, the training. And lots of PPE was purchased. It was a lot of effort and expense, but well worth it. So now NFPA is a complicated set of rules. We're going to talk about NFPA 70E. OSHA standards are a complicated set of regulations. The two have some things in common, but the relationship between the two documents is often confusing, with many wondering what role each plays. Can OSHA cite you for a failure to comply with NFPA 70E, and if so, how? The relationship between OSHA and NFPA 70E is an interesting one. Originally created at OSHA's request, NFPA 70E is considered the how-to standard. Paired with the NEC and the installation and maintenance standards, which are shown there, NFPA 70E highlights the recommended electrical practices that are in line with established regulatory requirements. If you've been around safety at all, or especially fire safety, you'll know that NFPA is the premier organization for fire safety and electrical safety too. They are a very well respected organization, and I respect them maybe more than I do OSHA. NFPA 70E is NFPA 70E the regulatory standard? No, but is NFPA 70E compliance required by OSHA? Yes and no. We're going to finish this conversation about that too. Legally, the NFPA 70E standard is considered an industry consensus standard used to assist OSHA in preparing electrical safety standards. This means that it is not directly incorporated into the Code of Federal Regulations. As you know, there's a lot of stuff that's incorporated by reference into OSHA standards. This is not. Seems odd to me that it isn't, but it isn't. But that doesn't tell the whole truth. Even though NFPA 70E is not codified in the OSHA standards, OSHA can cite you for failing to comply with the standards. Sound confusing? Well, the relationship between OSHA and NFPA. First, it's important to take a look at some of the caveats. For example, OSHA mandates that all electrical work on or near electrical equipment be done in a de-energized state, and that hot live work may only be completed in specific circumstances. NFPA 70E in turn defines those circumstances for justified energized electrical work by providing guidance for limiting voltage exposures, setting limited and restricted boundary requirements for qualified and unqualified personnel, and guidance on the required personal protective equipment. In this, OSHA will leverage NFPA 70E if needed. The general duty clause, as you know, one of the biggest ways OSHA can leverage NFPA 70E or any other thing that's not in the OSHA standard is to cite an employer through the general duty clause, 5A1. You've heard that before too. And it says, each employer shall furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. And each employer shall comply with the occupational safety and health standards promulgated under this act. And it says each employee shall comply with occupational safety and health standards and all rules, regulations, and orders issued pursuant to this act, which are applicable to his own actions and conduct. So employer and employee both have, under the general duty clause, have obligations here. Okay, remember the employee has to provide a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards. So this was interpreted and clarified in a letter from OSHA titled Relevance of NFPA 70 Industry Consensus Standard to OSHA Requirements, whether OSHA requirements apply to owners. In this letter, Acting Director Russell B. Swanson explained that compliance officers can evaluate an employer using a two-step process. This came from the director now of OSHA. First, an employer must fit one or more of the following rule categories. Exposing, that's an employer whose own employees are exposed to the hazard. So if I worked at OK Foods employees. Creating, an employer that creates a hazard which a different employer's employees are exposed. So we would be a creating employer if we had contractors come on our site. Now, we're not the exposing one because they're not our employees, but we're creating it. Correcting, an employer has been brought in specifically to correct hazards. And controlling, an employer with general supervisory authority over the worksite with the power to have safety and health violations corrected. So you can be more than one of those, obviously exposing and controlling. So an employer with a general supervisory authority over the worksite is usually the person who owns it or runs it, leases it maybe, but with the power to have safety and health violations corrected. If an employer fits one or more of these categories, which it probably covers everybody just about, the compliance officer must go to step 2, determining if the employer took sufficient steps to meet its obligations. Only if insufficient measures were taken may a citation be issued. If an employer was determined to play a role in exposing employees to a hazard, citations based on a failure to meet a general duty clause requirement can be issued. So if you were the exposing employer, you would have a duty of keeping all your employees safe from existing hazards. So how industry consensus standards fit into the general duty clause, as NFPA 70E is an industry consensus standard, generally accepted standards documented by an expert body. There's no doubt about that. An OSHA compliance officer may cite you for exposing a worker to a recognized hazard. So, as documented in the clarification letter, with respect to the general duty clause, industry consensus standards may be evidence that a hazard is recognized and that there is a feasible means of correcting such a hazard. Therefore, yes, there are scenarios in which you can be cited for failing to follow NFPA 70E. But, no but about that, but reasonable steps. In addition to the general duty clause, OSHA requires an employer take reasonable steps to protect employees. A 2006 letter documented this, noting where there is no 1910.335 safeguard that would fully protect against the hazards, an employer is still obligated under the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 to take reasonable steps that will protect the employee to the degree possible. In defining reasonable steps, NFPA 70E would be used by the employer to prove an affirmative defense of impossibility. In this, an employer who can show that compliance with the terms of a standard is impossible under the circumstances must also show that it used alternative measures to protect employees or that there were no such control measures. So if you're going to say it's impossible to do it, you have to take other actions to protect your employees and alternative measures or prove that there were no such things. That'd be a stretch. I mean, everybody knows about NFPA 70, anybody in safety business. So that'd be a stretch. So following a process that starts with a method in which controls range from immune to human error to mitigating risk. Sound familiar? It was a big part of the most recent NFPA 70E document, the hierarchy of controls. Where have you heard that before? Required PPE, in addition to the general duty clause, OSHA also requires, on 1910.132, that employers protect their employees from hazards that require the use of personal protective equipment, PPE. Where's the best place to find what PPE is required for a job based on the hazards and incident energy calculations? Who defines the 4 PPE categories? NFPA 70E. The required electrical safety program, company-wide, all-encompassing written guidelines are the foundation of an electrical safety program. NFPA 70E, section 110.1, requires a written document that directs activity appropriate for the risk associated with electrical hazards. The latest edition of NFPA 70E 2018 electrical safety program is defined as a documented system consisting of electrical safety principles, policies, procedures, and processes that directs activities appropriate for the risk associated with electrical hazards. This presents another area where employers should defer to NFPA 70E to become compliant with OSHA, developing an electrical safety program. And that's it. So we covered kind of 3 things. An overall of Ark Flash, my experiences with it, the program, and glad we did it. I think, as far as I know, nobody ever got hurt on any Ark Flash in the company. And we had a lot of people working on control boxes and stuff like that. And why NFPA 70E is not actually legally part of OSHA. It's not referenced, incorporated by reference, as OSHA does with hundreds or thousands of other things. And I don't know why they haven't done it with 70E, but it's still there. And really, our goal is, by all means, is compliance, but only compliance. In that compliance is the path towards safety. So our goal is to keep our employees safe. And to be compliant is a good way to do it in most cases, but in this case, I think the not even going above and beyond 70E, if people have to work on anything live, is the way to go. So there's a lot of other videos in this module, but not by me, probably like that. And so look at them, read them. And one that says the longest one, there's some questions at the end. I want you to listen to those questions they asked the guy too. They're interesting. So, all right. That's it for me. Be safe.